Chilliwack Creative Commission is gratefully located on the traditional territory of the Stolo people. Live from Cowork Chilliwack Studio C, welcome to the Creative Third Thursday. And once again, a big thank you to Tim McAlpine and the crew here at Cowork Chilliwack for hosting Creative Third Thursday. I am Geoff Edwards, and on the screen are members of the Chilliwack Creative Commission. The Chilliwack Creative Commission is a committee of the Chilliwack Economic Partners Corporation, and the commission is a one-stop resource for film, interactive, and digital media in Chilliwack. And the Chilliwack Creative Commission continues to promote filming in the Chilliwack by working with producers and location managers and providing options for diverse locations in Chilliwack. Our mandate is to attract and make possible economic growth in our sector. So one of several roles entrusted to Nettie Tam is as Chilliwack Film Liaison Officer. Give us a wave, Nettie Tam. There she is, back there. So wave if this is your first time at a Creative Third Thursdays. Welcome. In person, yes. You were at one of we did them on Zoom for a while as well. So Creative Third Thursdays is your monthly opportunity to meet and mingle with other creative people locally and those that want to meet them and have a cold beverage with them. So cheers. Oh, yeah. I see. Yeah. Another event to watch out for by the Creative Commission is our annual Pechakucha. That happens in the fall, so watch out for that. It's an amazing event. It's one of those great meet and mingles. We get a lot of people. It happens quite often at the Cultural Center. So Chilliwack is home to some really exciting emerging talent, and this afternoon we want to introduce you to one such person. And in a world flush with podcasts that come and go, the Bigger Than Me podcast has been around for 60 episodes, according to Google Podcasts today, because I checked it before I came here. So each episode is a long-form interview. There are 3 hours in length, up to 3 hours in length, and likely take listeners several pauses to listen to. If you're anything like me, that's what I did. I'd go on a walk and, listen to some more of that Bigger Than Me podcast. But the in-depth look at the subjects covered is really compelling, so I recommend you check it out. But let's meet the hardworking creative behind it. Please make some noise for Aaron Pete.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So Aaron, why podcasting?
I liked it because there's an oral component to it, and we talk about how individuals in Indigenous culture come from an oral tradition, and so I was interested in exploring that. I found myself listening to a lot of podcasts when I was traveling back and forth between UBC and here, and consuming a lot of content, and then I thought about our community and all the individuals who live within it who have such amazing stories, and that we perhaps don't have the opportunities that we'd like to kind of delve into their passion and how they got involved in what they do.
So does your podcast have a mission? What would be just to sort of give people an idea what you're on a mission to do with your podcast?
To show how amazing I think people in our communities are. I think sometimes we get lost in the mistakes of other people, the challenges facing our community, but we forget that there are people who really do thankless jobs who make a huge impact. And I think a really good example is Tim McAlpine, because he's not out here always talking about himself. He's okay with being in the background, lifting up other community members. And those are the people we sort of miss out on sometimes.
And how do you get together such interesting guests? Have you got a staff?
I do not have a staff. I go through myself and trying to figure out a person's background. So there's a lot of creepy stalking people through social media platforms to figure out their work and how they got involved in what they do, and sort of figuring out that long-term journey, not just when they made it big, but those years of putting in effort to build their understanding of a certain issue and make an impact. And I think that through that, I sort of get an idea of what that conversation long form would look like, and what I could bring to it. So like an example would be Brian Minter. I had seen a lot of interviews. He did an interview here. And so I wanted to bring something different to that. What has he talked about that he didn't get to elaborate on? And for me, that was his family. He talked about in a short clip with Tim that he likes to talk about his wife, but there's not that space. People are interested in why do you garden? How did you start the business? But they don't want to hear, well, not that they don't want to, but they don't have the opportunity to talk about his family and the value his family family brings to his business, and how that's sort of helped him bring a vision to life. And so being able to figure out what I would do differently in that conversation is important to me.
And how, like, let's talk about some of the other guests that you've had on your show. You explore a wide range of topics.
Yeah, that is probably my favorite part, is because no conversation is the same. So I get to dive into, I sat down with Councillor Bud Mercer, and we dive into policing and the Olympics and his involvement in city council and what he's trying to bring to that. And that's completely different than sitting down with Chris Koo, who's a birder, who's interested in protecting the environments that allow bird migration, which is so unique. And so I think one of the important parts, and I think we have a clip of me showing interest in the podcast, that's the important part, is to bring that curiosity. Tim Srigley, who's actually up in the corner of that photo, he's interested in leatherwork, and it's easy to look at people's passions or their interest and go, that's a hobby, and sort of look down at it. But I wanted to understand, like, you go to work and you have a different job, but you're interested in this area. What made you interested, and how can other people start to do the same? Because I think what YouTube and what podcasting has done, you talked about how so many people have podcasts, it allows us to figure out our interest. It doesn't have to be your job, but you can figure out your interest and start to share that with other people, and perhaps build a community around that. And that's what Tim did. And so I wanted to take that seriously. And I think sometimes when you're close with someone, you maybe forget that their passion is something real to them, that it's something to value and admire. When whatever that is that makes you interested in that, it's an interesting thing to me that people can find leatherwork interesting when I didn't even have that on my radar, or birding, or the oceans. And so that's sort of what I try to bring to it.
You know, I when I first saw your podcast, I thought to myself, 3 hours? How do you are people intimidated with the idea of sitting down for 3 hours and talking basically about themselves? Do you find that is a hurdle, or is it a difficulty, or do you struggle to pull 3 hours of talk out of people, or is it just happens pretty naturally?
It happens naturally, and I think that's the part that I didn't want to assume people were like small-minded and have those elements. There's a reason that we made everything short when we talk about media on TV. There were time constraints, but I think that we underestimate people to our detriment. If you can read a Harry Potter book, I think you can sit through a 3-hour interview, and hopefully that person's story is so engaging that you enjoy it, and that you're eager to hear how their life sort of goes. Because at the beginning of the conversation with someone like Carrie Lynn Victor, she talked about how her interest was completely separate from creating murals, and it was an injury to her hand that made her start to look at, how can I do this differently? And so that was an interesting journey for me to understand how she adapted and overcame. And I think that it's tough for some people, but for other people, they've been able to be constant listeners, and they're waiting for the next one. And those are the people I'm trying to gear towards. It's not the people who have real difficulty tuning into 3-hour interviews. It's the people who are like, when are you coming out with your next one? Those are the people who inspire me to go, I need to take on more. Because it used to be one episode every month, then every 2 weeks, and now it's every week.
So you're not only doing podcasts. What else is going on in your life?
I just took on a role as a business recovery advisor with Community Futures North Fraser and Community Futures Stolo. I just accepted a position with the board of the Chilliwack Cultural Center, and I'm working on a few businesses behind the scenes to try and bring to our community to make Indigenous culture more accessible. I think that's it. Oh, and I'm also upstairs is Alpine Legal Services, and I help with their social media.
So have you finished UBC Law?
I just wrapped that up and officially graduated, and it was actually my best semester was my last semester, so it was nice.
So I want to talk a little bit about time management and how do you work on that? Because as a creative person, sometimes we sort of get up and, some people talk about getting into a drift. They drift into their creative mind and they work. How does it work for you? How do you find, first of all, the motivation to do these things? I mean, having a podcast is not something that I don't hear advertising on your podcast.
Yeah.
So how are you motivated to do that? And all the other things that are in your schedule?
I think the most important part for me in starting this was having the buy-in of my partner, Rebecca, because this was going to be time apart from her. And so we had to talk about what it was going to look like, because it's usually a couple of hours for research, then reaching out to the guest, then a 3-hour interview, and then editing the audio and video, and then developing all the social media. And that's one of the hardest parts, I think, is social media and figuring out how to adapt what you're saying for the medium. So Instagram is a good example. It's just photos. So how do you get the message across of why you should listen to this person's story through that medium versus Twitter, which is more about writing and what you can say in a certain amount. So that was one of the challenges. And I think the important part was getting her support in doing all of that work. And so when I'm taking time away from her, I feel like I have a responsibility to make that time worthwhile and to make it successful and effective and make it meaningful for the guest and for us. And I think that responsibility to another person makes it less difficult to take the time and to try and make a schedule that works, because to me it's a responsibility to her time, which she's taking apart.
Can you think of any hacks that you've come across that help you in the time management and the motivation end of it?
No, it's usually I'm working until 9, sometimes 10 p.m. trying to get a podcast ready. I've worked on perhaps recording more episodes so that I can get each episode ready over time rather than having one each week where I'm kind of rushing to get it done. I recently started a Substack newsletter, and that's a whole new medium of communication to try and get across why people should tune in through writing and making the writing appealing to people where it's easier to read, because I find with law, I was taught to cut down my words, shorten it, make it quick, make it concise. And now it's about how do you make it interesting? How do you make people want to continue reading? What photos can we use? And so that's a new medium of communication that I'm trying to grow in as well.
So let's touch a little bit on the mechanics of it. What kind of equipment do you use? Well, what are we looking at here? This is a picture. That
was the first step in the studio. It was originally kind of like a closet that we were using to just store stuff in. Yeah. And then it was like, okay, if we're going to record a podcast, what does that look like? And it was important to me in the early stages to try and make sure that it looked professional, it felt professional. You're asking someone to sit for 3 hours. What do those chairs look like? Are they comfortable? Are people going to start to get sore and want to take a stand for a bit as a consequence? And so that was the early rendition of how the setup was going to look. And then I think we have a photo of what we ended up turning it into, which is very different. I had the eagle artwork taken from an artist up in Boston Bar. I wanted to make sure that the sound didn't echo too much, so we got some foam for that. And then the microphones, I wanted to be close so a person doesn't feel they can rearrange it however they like and sit however's comfortable. And then we can really get lost. And I think the headphones are the most important part. And my partner, Rebecca, actually just upgraded my headphones, because that's what I think we're like, just communicating, you and I, you think we hear each other clearly, but when you have those headphones on, you're dialed in just to what's going on right then and there. Mm-hmm. And then you get lost in conversation. And almost at the end of every episode, I say, and we just did 3 hours. And often the response of the person is, that felt like 15 minutes. That felt like 20 minutes. Yeah. Because once you start going through your journey and what you've overcome, I love when a guest is able to say, like, I put things together for myself in that conversation, because we often don't get to share what we've been through and that kind of journey. People, we're so rushed with coffee shops that to slow down and really think about how you got to where you are and how that thing that maybe you looked back on as a hardship was actually a time in your life where you decided to recommit to a certain goal or a certain ambition that you had. We don't ask people about those questions enough. And so I think creating that space, I've seen a lot of people gain a lot from those experiences and have amazing feedback after on the benefits.
So you're not just recording audio, though. You're making some video content as well. Is the whole thing recorded on video?
Yes. Yeah. It wasn't in the early 10 episodes, but that was something important to me as well, because like we talk about how social media has all these problems. So you don't communicate properly and you say things maybe you don't mean, and you get into these debates with people, and it's because it's not you, it's not all of you. And so when you get to see a person, maybe you disagree with them politically, like I've interviewed politicians, maybe you don't agree with them. You can at least see their body language. Are they being dishonest? Are they coming across as sincere? Is there passion in how they're operating? And I think that was something not everybody listened. Most people listen just to the audio, but making that video accessible on Spotify and YouTube was important to me, because then if there is a part where you're like, I want to see how that person's kind of feeling that emotion. I've had individuals cry on the podcast. Seeing that emotion in a person, I don't think we get enough of, and realizing that people are human beings first and foremost, and we should take the time to see and understand them.
So as we're still in the logistics logistics and the sort of mechanics of it phase, that's an enormous amount of storage because you're generating, it's not just one camera angle, right?
Yeah, it's 2 camera angles now. It took a little bit to get there.
And this is a 3-hour podcast.
Yeah.
So that's an enormous sort of logistical thing to deal with, right?
Yeah.
Are you doing post-production on these things?
Not too much. I try and leave it as raw as possible, because I think once you start cutting it, my favorite part to keep is those moments where people pause and they think and they slow down, because so often we want our content quick. Instagram tells us it needs to be under 60 seconds. You need to have a point to the story. But when you get to see a person really think something through and figure out what their position is, I think that reminds us all that we should take a pause for ourselves if we're going to answer questions or have responses. And so it is a lot of storage. Luckily, I've had the pleasure of working with Stola Archives. So they've taken, because I want to keep the raw footage just in case it becomes of use to anybody else. And so they're able to take all the raw footage now, and they have terabytes of data stored there.
But so looking back on this experience of creating this podcast, you must have learned a few things. Can you tell us what comes to mind if I say, what did you really learn from doing this? 60 episodes is quite a bit.
Yeah, on the topical side, I would say, like, I have an interview coming out with an ocean pollution expert who breaks down how like our clothing and our polyester is causing hardships on killer whales. And he's actually the person who discovered the killer whales are the most damaged with toxins in their system, and that the Inuit are actually paying a lot of the consequences because they eat killer whales and they eat animals up north that are larger. And so they're also paying a lot of the consequences for how we dress. So on a topical level, I've learned about birds, nursing, the Fraser River, the Indigenous history here, and about people's occupations. But I think the thing that I've learned the most is that people are kind with their time, and they have a story to share. And I think the secret to the podcast is that people are infinitely interesting. And I think maybe sometimes we forget that people, whether it's your grocery store clerk or a big hotshot person, that they all have a story of how they overcame things and how they grew to be who they were. And that's been really humbling for me to see just how brilliant and strong people are. When I choose someone like Carolyn Phelps, who had the orange shirt on, she came on initially. We were going to just talk about the hotel, and then she started talking about how she overcame Indian day school, and I couldn't have prepared for that conversation. I couldn't have done my research to a point where I would have known that about her. And so how she overcame that and turned the tragedies she faced there into sharing Indigenous art with people, I couldn't have predicted that. And so I think people are far more interesting than we realize, and that's, I think, the main thing I've learned out of this.
Well, I've learned something from your podcast. I think you've got an extremely interesting thing going on there. And one of the things I learned, I was a CBC interviewer for many years, and it was, you always should know the answer to the question you're asking your interview subject. But that's the traditional media thing, right? And what you just said struck with me on that point, because like you said, you ask a question in a way, and you give them time in this long form to explain in more depth, and it brings out things that you never even thought would be the answer.
I would say that some of the most emotions that I see out of guests don't come until that 2-hour mark.
Yeah.
And so I've had really interesting people that I'd love to interview say yes, but for 60 minutes, for 30 minutes, because that's the time commitment we're so used to. Yeah. But I've had to say no to some really exciting guests, because I want to stick to that mission, because I think that there's something that comes out of that 2-hour mark that you won't get just meeting someone for the first time, just sitting down and trying to get right into the questions. The challenge, I think, for me is trying to figure out that intro, that first meeting the person, and how to make them feel comfortable, but not having what they have to say said before the interview, where they're kind of going, remember when I mentioned this, and having them share that part of their journey for other people to be able to hear.
Cool. So will you stick around for a little while in case people have questions afterwards?
Of course.
This is not a 3-hour interview.
Yes.
So the Bigger Than Me podcast is available wherever you get your podcasts. Aaron Pete, everybody.
Thank you.
So, cheers. Thank you very much, Aaron.
Thank you.
So if you're posting to social media, Creative Third Thursdays, our hashtag. That's what you use there. It's right on the screen, and which makes it a great opportunity for you to share right now. Very good. So next time at Creative Third Thursday, we'll check in with film teacher, writer, dreamer, actor, maker, Michael Florazone. Thank you for coming, and cheers, everyone.